What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. I just wanted to let you guys know before you start this video that this is going to be a best of compilation. I've been feeling a little under the weather the past couple of days and my voice hasn't been fit to record, so hopefully I'll get back to recording some more news stories by the start of next week. Because this is going to be a compilation video as well, I will not be including the stories in this video in the Sunday compilation. Anyways, I hope you guys will enjoy the video either way, and I hope you guys will have a great day. Thank you so much for listening, and without further ado, on to the episode. This is a hard story to tell for a couple of reasons. First off, I was really young when this occurred, so the memory is not the clearest in the world. My parents have retold me the story to refresh my memory, but they tell it differently even between each other. The second reason I will tell you at the end of the story. I was 6 years old, and I was definitely a mama's boy. I followed my mom everywhere, and always wanted her attention. I remained like this throughout her entire life. Well, when I was 6 years old, a cousin of mine named Ethan moved in with us. His parents had recently died in a fire, and his mom was my mom's sister. My mom took him in, and when she did, everything changed very dramatically. Ethan barely ever talked. I guess that's pretty normal for a kid who just lost his parents. Not only that, but he also lived in town, whereas we lived out in the country. I imagine he had friends that he could go out and play with all the time back there, but we lived far away in a house that wasn't close enough to other houses to know anyone around. I was the only one that Ethan really had to play with, but Ethan would not play. He wouldn't go outside or try to climb trees or anything like that. He wouldn't even play board games, really. What he did do, however, was something I definitely did not like. Ethan was super obsessed with my mother. I didn't like that at all. Being a mama's boy, I wanted all her attention. But Ethan would follow her around. Sometimes he would grab her skirt with his hand and hold it up, as if he was trying to keep her from getting away. If my mom or I tried to stop him from doing this, he would start screaming and crying. Everyone thought it was just easier to let him do what he was doing, and the entire time it made me really mad. I was really young though, and probably too young to go out and explore the woods, but with Ethan being around my mom all the time, it was really the only thing I had to do. One day, which actually turned out being a pretty weird one, I went out into the woods to have a quick look around. Being out there was a lot more enjoyable than I thought it would be. The sky was covered with dark thunder clouds, and I was in danger of getting caught up in a storm. I really loved the atmosphere of the darkness during the day though. The wind and the occasional bolt of lightning or crack of thunder that would pierce the darkness of that storm. I don't know how long I was out there really, and at first I didn't really care. I just wanted to be by myself. However, when I decided to go home, I realized I had no idea how to get there. I tried walking back the way I came, but I couldn't be sure which way I'd come from. I hadn't taken the time to look at any landmarks that would remind me of the way out of this place. I was too young at the time to even think of that. The only Lost in the Woods story I ever heard was Hansel and Gretel, and I didn't have any crumbs of bread to lay down so I could remember my path. I was worried. I thought it would be easy to find my way home. I only had to keep walking the same amount of time I'd walked into the woods, and surely that would lead me back out. My 6-year-old mind accepted that as solid fact, as silly as it might seem nowadays. Well, as you might imagine, my idea didn't quite work, and the storm kept brewing and brewing. I was expecting it to break at any moment, and that scared me too. I'm not scared of storms themselves, but I've never been stuck out in one before. The idea of doing that is what scared me. Fortunately, despite the fact it seemed like it would storm any moment, it didn't start raining. For that, I was thankful. I kept thinking I would get even more lost by the minute, and I would never find my way home. I thought about bobcats, coyotes, animals that were in the area, and the idea scared the hell out of me. Even if the animals didn't get me first, I didn't have any food or water. My young mind was convinced I was definitely going to die out there. Then I saw something in the distance. It was smoke. I immediately thought that someone, possibly even my own father, had made some sort of bonfire. Maybe they could help take me back to my family. So I walked in the direction of that smoke. I was a lot less scared than I had been before. I knew I was going to get out of those woods and everything would be okay. I even remember smiling and running a little toward the smoke. As I got closer, I realized that smoke was definitely coming from my yard. I thought maybe my parents were worried I'd gotten lost in the woods and made a smoke signal to help me get home. I sprinted the rest of the way back into the yard of my house. My heart dropped, though, when I got close enough to see what was actually going on. No one had built a bonfire to help me find my way out of the woods. The house I'd lived in for my entire life was on fire, and not just any small fire either. The entire house was engulfed in flames. I stopped in the woods, looking at the most horrifying scene I had ever seen in my life. I didn't know what to think until I saw my family standing in the yard. My parents were there, and Ethan was standing beside my mom as always. I ran out of the woods directly toward them. My mom grabbed me and hugged me. She didn't know I had gone out into the woods. She thought I had been left behind in the house somewhere. She thought I might be dead, and she was absolutely terrified until she noticed me emerging from the woods. The fire department came quickly, but it didn't really matter much. There wasn't a lot they could do, as there were no hydrants out this far in the country. The truck had a tank of water if I remember right, but that didn't stop our home from burning right down to its foundation. The official report was that the house was burned down by an accident. However, even being 6 years old, I did not accept that. It seemed too weird to me. Ethan's parents died in a house fire, and less than 3 months after he came to live with us, our house caught fire as well. It seemed like an awfully weird coincidence to me. Yeah, I think Ethan burned down his own house and killed his parents. I think he burned down our house too, and maybe tried to kill us. I kept that thought to myself for many years. Ethan is on the autistic spectrum, which I think might explain his behavior with my mom. I don't think that has anything to do with him burning down houses though, so please don't think that. I think completely separate from his disability, he's just kind of an evil little fuck. My grandma took him in and adopted him basically after that. I only saw Ethan when we went to visit my maternal grandma, and I was glad he was gone. No other houses burned down as far as I know, so maybe I was wrong about him, but it just seems a little bit weird that it happened so close together. I'm 22 now, but this happened when I was 16. At the time, I lived in Staten Island, New York. For a little background, I'm a woman, and at the time I was 120 pounds soaking wet, with a height of 5'6". I thought I was invincible. I never imagined anything like this would have ever happened to me. It was March 17th of 2013, around 10:30 p.m. or so. I was leaving my boyfriend's house. He'd walked me to the local bus stop as he always did. We joked and laughed while we waited for my bus to show up. It was kind of late. There weren't many cars on the street. I happened to notice a black SUV parked right across the road. I didn't think too much of it at the moment. My bus eventually did show up, and I said goodbye to my boyfriend. I boarded and took a seat next to the bus driver. The bus was completely empty. The driver turned to me once we hit the first red light, and then he asked, "What are you doing out this late?" It was random and a bit creepy. "Oh, I was just hanging out with my boyfriend." We made small talk, and my initial apprehension was put at ease. The driver then told me it wasn't exactly safe to be out and about at this hour, and that I should be more careful. I nodded, but as I said before, I was an arrogant 16-year-old who thought she was invincible. As my stop approached, I looked down at my phone. It read 11:30 p.m. My battery was down to 5%. Wow, that's not great, I thought to myself. I exited the bus and said goodbye to the driver. He told me to stay safe, and I gave him another nod as the door folded back shut. For some reason, I just stood there and watched the bus make its way down the street until its taillights were well out of sight. As I stood there at the empty bus stop, a sensation of what I can only describe as impending doom washed over me. I made my way to the bench to sit down. The bus I needed to go to that dropped me off near my house was scheduled to arrive at 11:40, only 10 minutes left. As I sat there staring off into space, thinking about some things I had to do when I got home, a black SUV pulled right up to the bus stop. The uneasy feeling I had earlier intensified, but I did my best to play it cool. The man rolled down his window and called out to me, "Hey, excuse me, do you know what time the bus is supposed to be here?" He appeared to be a mix between Hispanic and Asian and had a medium build. At this point in time, I did not make the connection that this may be the same vehicle I saw just before I boarded the first bus. I figured he was probably waiting for somebody, so I replied that it would not be long. He then asked me how long I'd been waiting. It was then that I started to get a little bit freaked out. This guy was really giving me the creeps. I considered if I might just be overreacting. Perhaps he was just trying to pass the time. Still, I kept my guard up. I answered that I hadn't been there waiting long. He proceeded to try and make more small talk. I was trying to be polite, but I also kept looking at my pitch-black phone screen, trying to subtly hint to him that I was not interested in conversation. It was dark out by this point. The only luminescence was coming from some nearby streetlights. However, there were also two big trees outside the bus stop, positioned in such a way that they blocked out most of the light. If this guy tried anything, the dark would have provided decent cover. I nervously clenched my phone, with the uncomfortable feeling inside increasing with every passing second. He told me he was new to the area and didn't know his way around too well. He claimed that he was in the army and was stationed nearby. He then asked me where the beach was. "It's just down the street," I told him in a very matter-of-fact way, as to convey that maybe he should go there instead of talking to me. It was then that our eyes met, and I could see his face very clearly. His eyes were not like a normal human's eyes. It was as if they were looking right through me, staring at me like a hungry fox who just discovered a trapped and defenseless rabbit. He then asked me, "Would you mind showing me around a bit? Come on, get in the car for a little while." I may have been a naive 16-year-old, but I was not an idiot. I knew that if I got in that car, that would be the last time anyone ever heard from me again. I was trying my best to show him that I wasn't afraid, so I politely declined while looking down the street for my bus. He then began to beg and plead. It was kind of pathetic, honestly. I told him no once again. He then said something that I'll never forget. "Come on, baby, it won't take long." At that moment, my blood ran cold. My stomach felt like it was going to drop right out my ass. I felt absolutely sick, like I was going to throw up. Thankfully, at that moment, my bus was appearing in sight and coming down the street. A feeling of relief washed over me. I told him no, once again thinking that would be the end of it. He then told me he would drive me right home afterward. This guy would just not give up. I finally had enough. With all my strength and courage in me, I shouted at him to leave me the hell alone and called him a fucking loser. As my bus pulled up, I heard him say something genuinely terrifying, and I quote, "Fine, bitch, I'll just follow you and see where you live." My heart started to race. My hands broke out in a cold sweat. and my body began to tremble with fear. I quickly got on the bus. Honestly, I don't know why I didn't tell the bus driver. I think I was just in a state of shock. I was hoping that Mr. Moishbait Hunter in the SUV didn't mean what he'd said, and he was just pissed off and trying to scare me. When I sat down and looked out the window, though, I saw the headlights of the SUV tailing the bus. I thought I was going to have a mental breakdown. When the bus finally arrived at my stop, I ran like hell. I reached the front door of my house, which was usually unlocked. Tonight of all nights, though, it was locked from top to bottom. I frantically rang the doorbell while going through my bag to find my keys. I heard someone pull up out front. Without turning around, I knew who it was. Just like in the movies, I dropped the keys I was trying to put into the front door. I finally managed to unlock the front door. Before turning the handle, I heard a car door slam shut from behind me. I quickly ran inside and slammed the door shut in a panic. I explained to my mother and my older brother what happened. My brother ran outside and looked up and down the street. I was shaking, absolutely consumed by terror. My emotions finally got the best of me, and I could no longer hold back my tears. We called the police, and they came and searched the area. They asked me if I'd gotten a tag number. Unfortunately, I had to tell the officers that it was too dark to see. I did notice a sticker of some sort of bird on the backseat driver's window. It didn't dawn on me until right then that had been the same SUV that was parked across the street when I was with my boyfriend nearly an hour prior. They told me they checked the army base nearby and the surrounding area, but nobody had seen any vehicle matching the description I gave. All I could think about was what the bus driver had said to me and the irony of what took place on the same night. Years went by, and I didn't think much about that incident after that night. One day, I was scrolling through Facebook when I came across a picture. My friend had posted it. It was a story of a man who had been following her home from work for the past 3 days. It was the same guy I'd encountered 5 years prior. My heart felt like it was going to leap out of my throat looking at that post. I noticed that several other women had come forward, and they all shared similar experiences to mine. I ended up finding out that he almost kidnapped a 13-year-old girl. She allowed herself to be lured into his car, but once inside, she noticed a roll of duct tape, some rope, a pair of gloves, and a bottle of what turned out to be chloroform on the floorboard. She ended up jumping out the window while they were stopped at a red light. I don't know all the details, but apparently he also got physical with a woman who was pregnant and tried to force her into his car. He got pretty ballsy and started trying to abduct women in broad daylight. The news found out his name was Leo, and it was discovered he had a wife and 2 daughters who were around 3 and 5. They interviewed his neighbors, and to my surprise, they defended him, saying that all these women were just lying. It's truly unbelievable how stupid and useless people are. 5 separate accounts from 5 different people who have no connection with each other came forward and shared their experiences. Could you please dislodge your head from your ass and face up to the facts? Anyway, to this day, I have no idea whatsoever became of him. The last I heard, he was still at large. I hope they caught him, so no other young women have to be subjected to this monster ever again. So I've been a huge fan of these types of stories for years now, and finally have a fitting one of my own. For a quick bit of backstory, myself, my brother, and disabled mother all live together in a trailer about 30 minutes from Nashville, Tennessee. I was wary of moving there at first, for the stereotypes you may hear about trailer parks. Luckily though, it was not nearly as bad as we'd been led to believe. We had 0 issues in the last 10 years we've been here. All the neighbors are very nice, well-kept yards, everything else is okay. On to the story though. About a week ago, we were finally putting up our Christmas tree. drinking probably a little bit too much beer, and listening to Christmas music. The Christmas spirit was really in full swing. During our random banter, though, my brother suddenly said, "Oh yeah, I can't believe I forgot to tell you. Earlier today at work, the owner had to kick out some guy who was acting really creepy." My brother works as the stalker at a family-owned little market about a mile from our home. He went on to tell me this younger-looking guy was pacing the aisles, sometimes standing still for minutes, and not responding whenever anyone would ask if he needed help finding something. After about 20 minutes of this suspicious behavior, the owner finally asked him to just leave because he was scaring the other customers. Without a single word, the man left. We continued with our good time, hanging ornaments, drinking, getting our mom involved. It was all good. We wrapped up at around 10:30 and helped our mom to bed. We decided we might as well finish off the ton of beer we had left and admire our fully decked out Christmas tree. Around 11:30, we decided to go out on the front porch to share a cigarette, as we usually did when we had a good buzz going. My brother opened the door and almost immediately shut it back closed. I asked him what was wrong. "Holy shit, that guy I was just telling you about? He just walked down the street." He was out walking right past our house. I thought that was pretty strange, but I wasn't really that concerned. We waited for a few minutes to see if we'd see him again, but when he didn't appear, we went outside and smoked as usual. We went back inside after we were done. My brother and I aren't troublemakers at all, but I am pretty confident in our ability to defend ourselves if we had to. At this point, these were just thoughts in the back of my mind though. After all, I hadn't even seen the guy yet, and he didn't seem to be sticking around. Fast forward to about 2 a.m. We were more than drunk enough to go ahead and call in the night. After one more cigarette, my brother opened the door. Immediately, I could hear him saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, hey man, you good? Hey buddy, what's up, you good?" I was in the kitchen at the time, but quickly decided something didn't sound right. I rushed over to the door, and what I saw when I got to it was a younger man standing on our deck. He was pretty tall, about 6'4". I was realizing for the first time this must be the guy he'd been talking about. One thing my brother must not have gotten close enough to notice at work earlier, though, was this guy's eyes. I'm not exaggerating when I say I've never seen anything like it. His body language wasn't super menacing or anything, but his eyes were the strangest combination of wide-eyed bewilderment and pure fury, like us opening our door confused him and also made him extremely angry. I joined my brother in explaining to him that it's late and he should head home. After what I'd said, there was about 30 seconds of the man just staring. He walked off without a word. I peeked out our blinds to make sure he'd really left, and I couldn't see him anywhere. It was like he'd almost disappeared. We were joking and saying things like, "Well, that was pretty weird, huh?" It took a while for my adrenaline to calm down. I kept thinking to myself that what really bothered me was those 30 seconds of the man staring. It felt like he was deciding on what his next move should be, but what that could have been, I have no idea. I also didn't love that my brother said when he opened the door, the man had already been silently standing there. For how long, who can know? We calmed down by watching YouTube videos. After another 30 minutes or so, I finally said to my brother, "Okay man, let's just go to bed. I'll take one more look outside to be safe." I felt like it wasn't really necessary, but I opened the door anyway. To my surprise, the man was back. The streetlights are spaced very far apart in our trailer park, but at the very edge of our driveway, I could see his silhouette about 50 feet away, just staring at our front door. I should mention he's not there texting or on the phone with someone or doing anything else. He's just there standing and staring. I do feel a little bad in hindsight, because I'm sure this poor guy had some serious mental issues occurring. But between being drunk and exhausted and the furious looks he was giving us, I was over it. I put some bass in my voice. "Hey man, you can't just keep coming back to our driveway. You're being creepy. Just leave us alone." I didn't really want to call the cops on him. His demeanor didn't change at all. But the second I mentioned the word cops, that seemed to do the trick. He turned around and walked away. I hope we handled it well. I understand and empathize with people with mental health problems, and I have family and friends who unfortunately suffer from such things. However, I can't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen that night. He'd never actually left our porch earlier. He didn't leave the porch earlier that night until I showed up to the door, essentially making him outnumbered, and even then he still came back. I hope he's okay out there. We haven't seen the guy since. I also hope not calling the police wasn't a bad choice, and he isn't out there with bad intentions on someone else's front porch at 2 a.m. I wish I could figure out what that was all about, but during every interaction my brother and I had with him that day and night, he never spoke a single word. I love metal concerts. The atmosphere, the flashing lights, the pounding of the beat up your spine, there's really nothing like it. That very same atmosphere, though, can be a breeding ground for a lot of dangerous activity. I learned that the hard way at my last concert. I went with a friend to see In This Moment, Avatar, New Year's Day, and my personal favorite, Ice Nine Kills, as part of their Terror Tour. It sounds ominous already, but trust me, that concert was amazing. And they played all our favorites, and like the teenage metalheads we were, we screamed along with all our lungs put into it. New Year's Day went first as an opener, and the flashing lights caused spots in my eyes. Avatar went next, and the first half of their set went flawlessly. They played up the ominous angle of being with the devil between songs, and I got chills as the voice reverberated up my spine. They started up one of my favorite songs from their new album. I remember the gleam in my friend's eyes as she grabbed my arm and shook me in sheer excitement. The music and vocals built and built. The crowd was going absolutely feral down on the floor. I think I even saw someone in the pit get ousted up into the air and crowd surf. The chorus was just about to start when the lead vocalist froze in his tracks. He let out a strangled "oh" into the mic. The other members stopped playing a second later. The only sound was the quickly fading reverb from the amps on stage. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. Little puffs of smoke from the crowd of bodies on the floor were visible. I could swear they represented someone whose soul had just been scared out of them. People around us started murmuring, everyone wondering what was going on, while the singer was trying to compose things. No one would tell us anything. All of a sudden, he shouted into the mic, "Security! Can we get security here? Now!" The lights in the arena flicked on one by one, flooding the space with stark white light. After over an hour in the dark, it was almost blinding. After a second of blinking away spots, we could see that near the front of the stage, a small circle had formed in the crowd, giving a wide berth to someone in the middle. That someone was crumpled into a heap on the floor, and they'd started screaming. Security pushed their way through the remaining concert-goers and immediately ran to the guy with first aid in tow. They looked like they were struggling to turn him over, and the guy curled around himself as if in pain. I couldn't see very well from where I was sitting, but it seemed like his hands were clasped firmly against his stomach. When one of the security guys finally got him onto his back, the guy's hands accidentally fell to the side. And that's when what can only be described as a baseball-sized bubble of blood exploded across his shirt. Apparently, he'd scooped up the blood in his hands and was praying it didn't fall out. Security immediately realized their mistake and pressed firmly against the wound. People in the crowd began to call 911, and 20 minutes later, EMS and police showed up, with the full flashing lights and stretchers and everything. We were all told to stay calm, and were quickly directed outside to the parking lot. My friend and I clung to each other through the surge, so we wouldn't get separated. I remember that we didn't speak for a long time, even on the drive back. We saw some news that was written about the incident about a month later. Apparently, someone thought that when the guy shoved up against them in the mosh pit, he was hitting on their girlfriend or something. That's when they pulled out a knife and began stabbing him in the stomach. They pled guilty, with the defense that they were extremely high at the time, but that didn't lessen the severity of their sentence. As to how this person managed to sneak a knife past security personnel, we have no idea. It just goes to show you that even though a rough and tumble concert can be fun, it can also lead to reckless or even dangerous situations when emotions are running that high. I'm an investigator, and I'm gonna tell you about the most disturbing stalking case I ever worked. This story takes place in the mountains a few years ago. I had been entrusted to look into a sharp increase in the number of reported stalking cases in the area. I was placed in charge of a group trying to resolve these stalkings. I got a letter from one particular household, which simply read, "Please make all this stop." I decided to tackle this one first. The client hadn't been physically hurt by the stalker, but they said they'd seen them standing outside their family home multiple times, watching them. The client who wrote to us wasn't the victim themselves, but the victim's wife instead. She said she wanted this to end before somebody got hurt. The next day, I posted up near their family home and waited for this creep to appear. However, there was no trace of said stalker. Not that day, nor for the rest of the week. I made an interim report to explain that the person had not been spotted. As I was explaining this to the client, she cut me off and blurted out that the stalker had been there the whole time and I must be blind. I showed her all the photos I'd taken for the job and told her that I hadn't seen anyone there. I couldn't believe that I had missed something. I could tell she was skeptical, so I asked her if she wanted me to continue with my investigation. She agreed, and I continued with said investigation, expecting to find nothing at this point. I was questioning if the client was having hallucinations possibly. The next day, though, I finally saw what the client was talking about. Someone showed up while I was staking out the house, and I immediately started taking photos and shooting video with plans to show it to the client. Later that night, I showed my findings to them and asked, "Is this the lady who's been stalking your husband?" Her face went pale, and she nodded. Things intensified when I saw the woman again the next night. I noticed there was a car parked outside their house. I was with my colleague this time. He ran the plates with the Transportation Bureau and said he was told there was no vehicle registered with that plate number. We decided to tail this suspicious car. It headed out through the mountain roads. Because it was late at night, no cars passed us by, so we had to keep our distance and watch the car speeding ahead along the dangerous roads. The stalker's car veered off onto a dirt road at some point and suddenly stopped altogether. We wondered if our cover had been blown. The car was stationary and no one was getting out. We were far enough away at the entrance of the dirt road. My colleague said she wouldn't notice if we went by foot, but she might hear the car coming. I couldn't argue with that. To be honest, this situation was a bit unnerving. I got out and crept toward the stalker's car. It was parked next to an old and battered, dilapidated house that looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. I remember thinking to myself, could anyone really live here? I noticed there were no lights on in the house at all. The car did stop here though, so the stalker must be in there. I staked it out for 20 minutes. I wanted to see if there were any signs of life in the house. What surprised me in the next moment was a terrible shriek coming from the house. I started shaking when I heard it again. It really freaked me out. I ran back to the car to check on my colleague, but when I got back, he was gone. I thought he would be there waiting for me to return. I called out to him, but the second I did, I heard a cell phone ringing. The cold, generic ringtone pierced through the mountain air. It was coming from a bush near the side of the dirt road. I crept over to take a look. The cell phone was laying on the ground. It was my colleague's phone. I went over and grabbed it and answered it. I heard someone saying some garbled speech, and then the line cut out. I tried to call back, but the phone was out of signal. If he was waiting in the car, why would his phone be lying in the bushes? I heard more screeches coming from the house. What could be going on in there? Could he be in there with that stalker? It was one of the worst moments of my life. I felt like my mind was thick with fog. I couldn't stand the terror in that scream. It was something like I'd never heard before. It's something I haven't heard since. My colleague's phone began to ring again. I thought it was out of signal. Who the hell was calling? I answered it. Of course I had to. I heard my colleague's voice, and then I heard some garbled speech again. I ran back to the car, threw open the door, got in, and locked it. I just waited to see if he would come back. I didn't know what else I could do. The first light of morning came, and he still wasn't back yet. I went towards the house. I wanted to know what was making the noises in there, and if something had happened to him. The other car was still parked outside. Was she still there? I thought, as I entered the house. There was nothing inside, no signs of life at all, yet I'd heard all that screeching. It was so weird. The place was completely abandoned. I went back outside and looked at the stalker's car. It was really old and damaged, and looked like it could fall apart at any moment. The interior was full of dust. I waited as long as I could in the hopes that my colleague would suddenly reappear, and this would all be over. But after several more hours, there was no sign of him. I went back to the office to report what had happened that night, and to see if anyone had heard from him. There was no news. The other guys from my office came with me to check out the abandoned building, but we couldn't find a shred of evidence. We'd been back there at later dates to check on it as well. There's been no signs of life there. After some time, my colleague's family reported him missing. Since there was no evidence of foul play, and we can't identify a suspect or his whereabouts, the case is very likely to go cold. I've been searching for any clues that could lead me to what happened to him, but so far I have nothing. I couldn't even use the photos or the video I took. Some of the files became corrupted. I went back to the client and they said they hadn't seen the person since. I wonder what on earth happened to my colleague, and what on earth was going on with that person. My colleague is still missing to this day, and I pray he'll be found safely someday. Let me start by saying that I was really only looking to hook up. I had just been dumped by my boyfriend, and I'm not the bar type. I figured that an online dating service would be a more reasonable option. I used a local personal service, and I've been talking to this guy for about 2 days before agreeing to meet up with him. His name was Mike, and he told me that he used online dating because he was suffering from depression and was on a medication that made it hard for him to perform. He decided it was easier to meet women this way so they could know beforehand than to meet up in person and have to explain when they started getting physical. He went on to tell me, though, that he had a good feeling about me and that I was exciting to him despite his medication. Okay, seemed cool enough. I decided to go over to his place to see if we really did have any chemistry. We both seemed to be looking for the same thing, a hookup. When I got there, he was waiting for me in the living room. We started making out, and I could tell he was getting a little aroused, but was having some issues. When he said that he knew what would help and that it was in his bedroom, I willingly followed. Walking in, I couldn't help but notice his bed being surrounded by cat condos, lots and lots of them, some structured to be as tall as I was. I knew that he had cats, but I assumed he'd meant 1 or 2, and that they were just hiding when I came over. Nope, he had 10, which all came out from underneath the bed. When we sat on it, they all rushed out and went to their perches on the cat condos to watch us after rubbing against him. He then went on to start making out with me again and was massively aroused. At this point, I was massively creeped out though. I like cats and I have some myself, but having them watch me pee freaks me out, much less them watching me be intimate with someone. I excused myself, openly admitting this was a little bit too strange for me. I left and he followed me, begging me to give him another chance and help him. I left anyway. For the next few days, he continued to message me, asking me to come over and saying he'd made some real progress with me. I blocked him after receiving a photo of him nude on the bed surrounded by the cats. I'm a 26-year-old woman, and at the time this story takes place, I was a broke college student. I was very naive and a chronic people pleaser. I avoided confrontation at all costs. One night, I was waiting on the bus home after visiting some friends. It wasn't very late at night, only about 7 p.m. on a weeknight. I was tired and I was really looking forward to getting home to unwind and relax. I'd been at this bus stop loads of times, and I often encountered some familiar faces while waiting. This time, though, it seemed to just be me. I popped my headphones in and listened to some music while I waited. I messed around on my phone, keeping a close eye on the time. The bus was due at 20 past, and I'd only been there for about 5 minutes. And that's when I sensed someone near me. I glanced over to my side and saw a man around my age had silently come underneath the shelter with me. I ignored him and continued looking at my phone. Suddenly, though, I heard someone loudly call out to me, "Hey, excuse me!" I turned to see the man was right next to me, staring down at me. I took out my headphone and asked him what he wanted. He grinned at me before asking what time the bus was coming. I told him it was usually around 20 past the hour, then looked down at my phone again, hoping he'd get the hint that I didn't want to have a long conversation. Sadly, he did not. I could sense him still staring at me, and when I looked at him, he didn't look away at all. I smiled awkwardly, which looking back, I wish I hadn't done this, because it probably only encouraged him. Like I said though, I was a really huge people pleaser back then, and to be blunt, I was an idiot. It seemed like out of nowhere that he started trying to talk to me again. He asked if I took this bus often, to which I responded yes, and again gave a tight smile at him, willing him to just go away and leave me alone. I knew immediately I shouldn't have admitted I took this bus regularly, because now he could determine my schedule if he really wanted to. He started complimenting me. "My, you have such gorgeous skin," he told me, which I found to be a bit of an odd compliment. I continued smiling and trying to focus on my phone. By now, I had turned my music off, but I kept my headphones in to give the impression that I was trying to ignore him. I knew I needed to be able to hear him perfectly though, because he was being so weird and creepy. I felt uncomfortable. When the bus came, I was relieved, even though he got on with me. It wasn't exactly packed, but we also weren't alone either. I thought surely he would leave me alone now. I was so wrong. I sat at the front, and to my discomfort, he sat directly across from me. I was sitting in these fold-down seats, usually reserved for people with prims or wheelchairs. I wanted to be closer to the front, as I felt very uncomfortable. He sat on those same seats directly opposite me. When the bus started, he didn't say anything. He just kept staring at me. Eventually, he started asking me over the engine noise what stop I got off at. I politely informed him that wasn't any of his business, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I was texting a friend what was happening, and I also texted some of my family members just to let them know of the situation too. I was feeling so uneasy, and it was only getting worse. He told me that he wanted to walk me home, and that he could come over to my place and show me a good time. I was disgusted by him. He was leering at me and kept talking over and over again about my skin. "You know, you have such good skin. I want to stroke it so badly. I love girls with nice skin like yours. I bet you have even more that I can't see." I was so disgusted by his comments. I felt angry. I was getting angrier at myself being so scared that I couldn't bring myself to just tell him to fuck off. And this went on for a bit, before the bus driver stopped the bus and got out of his seat. He approached the man and demanded he get off immediately. He must have heard what the man was saying, as he was talking quite loudly. The man began to protest, and even had the audacity to say that he was my boyfriend. The bus driver looked at me before shaking his head at the man, then demanding he get off right now. He informed the guy that if he refused to comply, there would be some real trouble. The man begrudgingly slinked off the bus, glaring at the bus driver. Glaring at both of us. The bus driver then asked me if I was okay. I just broke down. He asked me if I had any friends or family I could call to meet me when I got off the bus. I told him I could call someone. He nodded before telling me he'd overheard the man being creepy a few times and decided to intervene. He had 2 daughters himself, and if one of them were me, he'd really want someone to intervene to protect them too. He went back to driving. I called one of my friends. No one else on the bus did anything. There were about 4 people all around my age, but they just stared at me uncomfortably. I don't know if they felt guilty or maybe called out by the bus driver, but none of them did a single thing. To be fair, maybe they didn't hear or notice anything was amiss, but still, it's scary to know I was so close to these people, and I was still preyed upon by some weirdo. When it was my stop to get off, I kept thanking the driver for helping me. He told me not to worry and to stay safe. I didn't live far from the bus stop that I got dropped off at, and I remained on the phone with my friend until I was finally home with the door locked. I avoided that bus stop from that day forward, always opting to get a taxi home instead. I never saw the creepy man again, and I hope I never will. I think the word toxic is actually toxic. We throw the word around like it's some sort of frisbee. One topic that's always got brought up in that toxic conversation is toxic exes. How exes are terrible. Not all exes are bad, mind you, but the ones that are, I truly think encompass the word toxic. You see, I was engaged a few years ago, and it ended very poorly. My fiancée got a job about 100 miles from our hometown, so I moved with her and started a life there. I didn't have friends or family or anyone to turn to when we broke up, and because of the job I'd started, I decided not to head home just yet. It's not important how things ended, but they did end very poorly. She begged me to come back at the end, but I couldn't put myself through all of that all over again. Not right after the breakup. She kept the house, and I found a small 1-bedroom apartment. I just hoped I would be able to meet some new friends, which I'm really bad at, by the way. A few weeks after we'd broken up, I was sitting in the apartment sulking, which was my favorite hobby around that time. The apartment was on the first floor of the building, which was really like the half-basement, if that makes any sense. My windows were at level 1. It was just my head that was above ground. The rest of the apartment was below it. I had a lovely view of absolutely nothing to help me cope with my crippling depression at the time. One night, while I was just sort of being a bum, my power went out. We were having a pretty bad storm. The last time we'd had a storm like this, the power had gone out for several hours. I knew I couldn't just sit there in silence, and since it was getting late, I couldn't really go anywhere anyway, even though I probably wouldn't have if I could. I lit up a few candles that I had and sat at my table. It was a small table that only fit 2 chairs. I loved to draw and color in high school, and I had some talent before I gave it up. This was the perfect opportunity for me to draw and just sort of get lost in something that I used to love. While I was drawing, trying to get my mind off the events going on in my life, I heard something. It was a loud noise that sounded close by. Unfortunately, it was too dark to see everywhere in my apartment, other than the little area I was sitting in with the candles. I slowly walked over to where I heard the noise. Lying at my window outside was what looked to be some sort of figure. I jumped back because I was scared. I knew this was a crazy idea. No one would break into this apartment. They would have to get on their stomach and practically crawl inside. Not to mention, hardly anyone in town even knows who I am. I went back to the small table and blew the candles out. I wanted to use the darkness to my advantage and be able to see out the window better. I didn't know for sure what I was seeing at this point, and it's possible it could have just been a skunk or something trying to escape the storm. I just didn't know. I went back over to the window, and I could see it clearly now. This was no animal, and it was not my imagination either. Lying against the ground, trying to open the window, was a person dressed in all black clothes. I freaked out. I didn't know what to do. The obvious answer was to call the police or the authorities or whoever, but I don't know why. In the heat of the moment, that just didn't cross my mind. The only person I really knew was my ex-fiancé. I decided to give in to my fear and loneliness and call her for help. Right as I pressed call, though, a light could be seen shining out through the window, and a brief melody of a ringtone could be heard. The call went right to voicemail after that. Knowing what was most likely happening, I decided to call right back and see if it was just a coincidence. Sure enough, the light and ringtone went off for a split second before the intruder outside shut it off. It was my ex, trying to break into my apartment. Why at this hour in this weather? Her intentions were clearly sinister. I started to yell, but she kept trying to break in through the window. Thankfully, it remained locked, and I called the police. As soon as she heard me on the phone, I saw her get up and run off. I told the cops everything when they arrived. They actually didn't believe me right away. They looked almost annoyed, like I was bothering them with this. But when they looked out the window, they could see the spot in the dirt where someone had been laying down, and there were clearly signs of forced entry. They finally agreed to follow up and see where my ex was. When the cops went and questioned her, of course she seemed to deny everything, which didn't really surprise me. She said that she had been with her new boyfriend and that I needed to move on. The guy also vouched for her. He said that she was at the house the entire night with him. Either this guy was in on it, or she was already manipulating him. I caught her out for being a liar, and I was the one who was branded a liar and crazy ex at the end of it. When I brought up that I'd called her twice and both times the phone lit up, she said her phone was broken so it couldn't have been her. That was it for me. I couldn't live in this town anymore. Now that I didn't feel safe being here, I paid an early termination fee for my lease and moved away to stay with my family until I got back on my feet. I've never heard from her again, and I'm so thankful for that. My life is much better without that toxic human being ruining it. People can be very weird. We can even affect people that we never even notice. It just blows my mind, some of the thoughts that run through other people's heads. I'll tell you my story, and you'll know what I mean. At the time, I was working a ton. I was saving money to buy my girlfriend a ring. Spoiler alert, she's my wife now. We were renting a small house, but it was still better than an apartment. At least we weren't sharing walls with someone else. I was also saving money so we could buy our own place. She was saving money for the same reason. Since I was working so much, she decided to volunteer for a 5-day retreat with the company she worked for. She would get paid a ton of overtime, and this would allow me to work overtime at my job even more than I was already doing. I was going to miss her, but it seemed like a great opportunity to bring home some extra cash, especially with the holidays rapidly approaching. On Wednesday, when I left for work, I noticed a weird smell in my car. Not a bad smell, just a very strange one. It was sort of like a perfume, but one that a younger girl would wear. Some thoughts did cross my mind, but I eventually chalked it up to some weirdness I didn't understand. Honestly, I didn't really care that much either. It was just a small thing. That night, I had a horrible time sleeping. I told myself it was most likely because I missed my girlfriend so much. I was always used to her being there, and now this was the 3rd night in a row I was sleeping alone. I swore that I could hear noises all night long, coming from downstairs. It wasn't loud or scary enough to raise any alarm bells though, so again I ignored these weird signs and told myself it was probably just some house noises, or maybe the wind. Thursday morning arrived, and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I made my coffee and hoped that would do the trick. When I got out to the car, I found it unlocked. I'm always good about locking the car door. I had been working quite a lot though, and the thought of forgetting to lock it was on my mind. Ignoring the unlocked door though, I got into the car and started to drive to work. Same story as the previous day. I could smell this weird perfume again. Now, some red flags were raising here, but I couldn't possibly begin to piece together what was going on. Every thought I had ended with me blaming it on myself for being too tired and hallucinating, or maybe missing my girlfriend and thinking about her bringing out this smell. It was the most logical explanation, at least at the time it was to me. I left work that evening, and once again the smell in my car was clear. I even had a coworker come over and smell it, just to make sure I wasn't being delusional. He said that he could smell it too. It was probably just my girlfriend's perfume, and because I missed her so much, I was starting to subconsciously notice certain smells I may have gone nose blind to. Thing is though, I knew the smell of her perfume, and this was not the right one. What he suggested did seem kind of logical though. I assumed that maybe he was correct. Maybe my sense of smell was adjusting. When I got home again though, all I could smell was that weird perfume. Now I was really weirded out, trying to convince myself that my coworker was correct. It was no longer working though. I decided to take a shower and go grab some food and a drink at the bar, just to sort of unwind. My girlfriend was coming home the next afternoon, and it was also my first day off in 13 days, so I was ready to relax. I got home late that Thursday night. It was around midnight or so. I was getting myself ready for bed when that smell hit me as soon as I opened the door to the house. I was more annoyed at this point than anything else. I was never scared really. It was just so weird. I got into bed though, exhausted after getting home, and started to fall asleep. I knew that my girlfriend was coming home tomorrow, so I was just hoping this weird smell would go away. I must have fallen asleep for a little while, because I was awoken by someone climbing into the other side of the bed. For a second, I thought it was my girlfriend. I was still half asleep, and my mind just went right to her. As this person was getting into bed, they shushed me. I turned back around, and she started to cuddle up to me like she was the big spoon, which she had never done before. I was so tired and so happy that she was home that I didn't even care. A minute or so later, once I started to fully wake up, my eyes shot open. I looked down and saw a woman's forearm lying across my body. I instantly recognized the perfume in the air. This was not my girlfriend. I started to fully come to my senses. She wasn't supposed to be home until tomorrow afternoon. Why would she have arrived in the middle of the night without saying anything? I jumped out of bed and began freaking out. I turned on the lights, and sitting in my bed was some young woman I'd never seen before. She was smiling and kept brushing her hair away from her face. She kept asking me what was wrong and calling me babe. I was yelling for her to get out of my house. She just kept smiling. I called the police, but she didn't even react. She started to shush me again and began rubbing my arm. The entire time I was freaking out, telling her the cops were on their way, but she didn't seem to care. She didn't look crazy or anything. She looked like a completely normal person. She got out of bed to try and console me. She put on a low-cut, fluffy robe to do so. The cops showed up, and I immediately ran out to them, telling them this random woman had just let herself into my house. She wasn't armed, and she hadn't tried to hurt me. They looked into her, and there had been no issues with the law prior or anything like that. I heard that she was just some random, completely normal girl. The cops took her away, and she said in a weird, calm voice as she was leaving that she loved me and she'd be coming back in time. This was just a misunderstanding. My heart was going 100 beats a second, but not out of love. After some investigating, it turns out this woman was our neighbor on the street we lived on. She was a very quiet girl, so quiet that we didn't even know she existed on the same street. She developed some obsession with me for some reason. When she noticed my girlfriend hadn't been around for a few days, she started to break in. The poor girl convinced herself I was in love with her. Through all of this, she never seemed that dangerous. Thankfully, that was the case, because who knows what would have happened if she actually meant me harm. Even though the woman didn't try to harm me though, it doesn't make the situation any less creepy. I had some person living in my house for almost a week, getting into my bed with me when I was sleeping. She never returned to her house. We moved shortly after that anyway. From what I understand, she had family, and the family was notified. Last I knew, she was being treated for some type of illness. I'm not sure what it was, so please forgive my ignorance. Now you know what I mean though, when I say some people are just so weird. You truly never know what could happen. In summer of 2017, my boyfriend and I were visiting my family before my brother started middle school that August. My parents were watching TV in their room, and I was working on my schoolwork. My brother and boyfriend were playing a video game together in the next room over. They were gracious enough to keep the volume down so I could concentrate on my essay. At around 8:30 p.m., I suddenly remembered I needed to put some gas in my car. Finishing the last paragraph, I called my parents to let them know I would be gone for a few minutes, but I was coming straight back. The gas station was about 10 minutes away from my home, so I would have been back in about 20 minutes or so. I grabbed my keys, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and left without another word. After 10 minutes of driving, I arrived at the station and pulled up to the nearest pump. As I started pumping the gas into my car, though, an older beat-up truck appeared in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look and noticed two dark figures just sort of sitting there. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features, but they seemed to be talking while checking out the place. I brushed it off and finished filling up my tank. Before I got back into my car, though, I decided to head into the building to grab some snacks for my boyfriend. I walked inside, quickly picked out some items, and just as I was done making my purchase, two men wearing jeans with black hoodies burst into the store with guns drawn. Both of them appeared to be in their mid-20s and fairly built. "Everybody get on the ground!" the first man shouted. The cashier and everybody else in the store immediately obeyed his orders. There was a few panicked whispers until one of the men shouted at them to shut up. I felt my heart pick up its pace, and my blood ran cold. These men were about to rob this place and possibly shoot up the customers or the cashier. I prayed silently to myself that no one would be killed or seriously injured. One of the men grabbed my hair. "You stand," he commanded. Fearing for my life, I did as he ordered. Almost immediately, I felt an arm snake around my wrist and take hold. I would have elbowed him and stomped his foot, attempted to punch his face even, but I was so paralyzed in fear to think or do anything. The worst part is I felt a gun aiming at the back of my head. I tried squirming away from the man's grip, but he just held me tighter and hissed at me, "Stay still, sweetheart, and no one gets hurt." The other man shouted at the cashier to hand over the cash or to quote, "You're gonna be scraping this bitch's brains off the wall." I had no connection with the cashier in any way, except for just being a customer in the store, but I could tell from the look in his eyes he wanted to protect me in any way he could. He was an older guy, possibly in his 60s, with glasses on his face. I knew he had no choice but to comply with their demands. He hastily unlocked the register. As he was handing over the cash, I felt the barrel of the gun press against the side of my head, and I nearly started to freak out. I restrained myself and started to tear up a little. My throat burned from holding it back, all for the sake of keeping myself alive for as long as possible. Once every last dollar bill was in the man's hands, sirens blared from outside. The man then stuffed the money into a backpack, then punched out the cashier. I was thrown to the side, my stomach and arm hitting the edge of the counter. I fell to the floor. As soon as the two men ran outside, they were surrounded by police, and within seconds were tackled to the ground and handcuffed. I was still catching my breath, but I was more concerned about the cashier. I pulled myself up and peeked over the counter. For the most part, he seemed to be okay, although I could see his right eye was turning black. His glasses laid broken on the floor. "Are you all right, sir?" I weakly asked him. My stomach was still hurting. "I'm a little blind at the moment, but I'll be okay," he responded. "Is everyone all right?" a familiar voice asked. One of the cops was very good friends with my father. He'd entered the store. "Just us two might need some attention," I said. The officer turned towards us. He immediately recognized me and asked if I was okay. The cashier and I told him everything, as other cops came in and questioned the other customers. It turns out a customer had snuck into the bathroom and called 911 without the robbers noticing. Once the questioning had finished, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I burst into tears, not because I was in pain, but because I had just endured the scariest moment of my life. I just wanted to get home and put an ice pack on my stomach. The cashier was rushed out of the store on a stretcher. The officer asked if I needed any medical attention, but I shook my head and cried that I just wanted to go home. As I walked out of the store, I noticed a few cops investigating the truck I had seen earlier. It then clicked in my head that that vehicle belonged to the two men. They must have been scoping the place out, waiting for the right time to strike. I was pretty sure that I was the first person they saw to use as bait. A police car followed me home that night. Eventually, we came to my neighborhood, and my mom ran out of the house and embraced me in her arms. She kept asking me what happened, but I could hardly speak because I was crying so much. Once I was inside, my boyfriend saw me and wrapped me up in his arms. He held me until I calmed down. My dad's friend came in shortly after and explained what happened at the gas station. After the cops left, I was laying on the couch watching TV with an ice pack on my stomach. My brother came in and asked me what happened, but I knew he had to go to bed soon, so I promised I would tell him in the morning. I was still pretty shaken up about what happened, and I didn't want to scare him. I then made a promise to myself that I would never go certain places at night ever again. I've never had the best of luck with guys. I appear to have poor taste when it comes to dating. After separating for good from my kid's father after 5 years, I was ready to just be myself. After about 3 months of being a single mother, My neighbor approached me, stating that a friend of his named Steve would like to meet me. It didn't take long before he charmed his way into my life. The first 6 months were amazing, but he began to drink more and more, and each time he would get extremely agitated. He would start fights with random people, and even some of our friends. Slowly, our friends would stop coming around altogether, knowing how Steve got when he drank. This, however, did not stop him from drinking at all. Now all the anger was solely aimed at me. It took roughly 6 to 8 months of buildup, from name-calling and shoving to punching and choking. Suddenly, this became a very abusive relationship. One time, I escaped out the bathroom window. He later found me by beating up a friend of mine until he told him where I was. Steve began stripping all my clothes off in a drunken rage, while laughing at me and challenging me to dare try and escape. The last night was by far the worst, though. Before Steve started drinking that night, I told him my son, 3 years old now, was not feeling very well, and I was going to stay with him as he fell asleep. My plan was to spend the night with my son. At around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the bedroom door open. I laid there pretending to be asleep. Several seconds went by. I held my breath as tears began to form in my eyes. I suddenly felt his hand on top of my head. He grabbed my hair and yanked me out of bed, whispering in my ear, "I know you're avoiding me." Once in the living room, he threw me on the floor and accused me of trying to leave him. He demanded to know why. Before I could even answer, he angrily came to the conclusion it must be another man. "I swear to God, if I catch you with another man, I'll kill you." He was obviously more drunk than normal. He punched and kicked me a couple of times, and I fell to the floor. I started to crawl to my son's room. He slowly came from behind me, asking me where I thought I was going. He walked in front of me and kneeled down. "You stay right there, or I'm gonna hurt you real bad." He then sat on the couch and watched me as I sat on the floor. After about 30 minutes, it appeared he had passed out on the couch. I decided that this was my chance to escape. I put on an oversized shirt, picked up my son, and slowly crept by him. Suddenly, he woke up, though, and grabbed my leg. "Where are you going?" I stammered out that I was going to the kitchen with my son to get him a drink. He angrily told me to hurry it up. As soon as I entered the kitchen, though, I ran out the front door with no pants or shoes on, and no purse either. I carried my son all the way to the police station, which thankfully was only a few blocks away. The police station is set up in such a way that you go into a room and press a button and talk to someone on the intercom. I ran in and put my back to the wall. I pushed the button behind me as I slowly slid down into a sitting position while holding on to my son. I was waiting for Steve to burst through the door at any moment. I remember thinking if I was going to be beaten, I would at least rather have it be on camera. On the speaker, I heard a voice call out, "How can I help you?" All I could do was cry. I couldn't even get a word out of my mouth. I didn't know how to explain. 2 officers came out to assist me. A female officer took my son and got him some food. I went with the male officer to make a report, and he gave me a blanket. After 15 minutes, I heard Steve screaming my name. As they brought him down the hallway, I held my breath as if he knew I was behind the door. 30 minutes later, an officer came back with a sergeant. At first, I thought they were going to tell me to go back home and gather my belongings while Steve was being held in custody. Instead, they asked me about his anger issues and if there had been any previous fights. I explained to them Steve's alcohol problem and how he had become increasingly more violent. They then showed me a list in Steve's handwriting, detailing how he would dismember my body, in a good spot where I would be buried without being found. He also had the possible dates written down, with past dates crossed out. I couldn't breathe when I read this. By this point, tears were streaming down my face. I looked at the cop and asked him what this meant. He looked back at me and said, "That means you're lucky." Steve was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. I left back home to Arizona before the trial started, but gave a detailed statement before I left. Steve, of course, pled not guilty, but in the end he received 2 years in prison. Just before I left for Arizona, I received a letter from Steve. It simply read, "It's not over. You'll always be mine." This week has been quite hectic. My 3 kids have the flu. Oldest was first, then my younger 2 caught it as well. After a visit to the clinic, I was heading to the CVS down the street from our house to grab their prescriptions. I decided last minute to drop my kids off at home with their dad so they could rest while I went inside the store to pick up some Pedialyte. I consider our neighborhood to be quite safe. I've even taken walks after dark and never felt afraid. Most of our neighbors are older folks who have lived there for over a decade. When I pulled up to the CVS, I parked on the side parallel to our street. It's darker on that side, but the entrance is right around the corner and well lit. There was a man standing outside. He walked in front of my car, and I could hear him saying something. My music was kind of loud though, so I figured he was on his phone or something. No real red flags yet. My husband called me as the man walked back towards the corner adjacent to the entrance. I got out of my car still on the phone, telling my husband, "Yeah, kiddos have the flu, I'm picking up the medicine, etc." To my surprise, in a very pleasant voice, the man then called out to me, "Hey, I got a question for you. You know where Main Street is?" I was assuming he was asking for directions or the location of something. I told him I do. I was still holding my phone to my ear. It was a bright pink case, so I'm sure he could see it. Now the man was standing directly in front of me. There was a pillar and a trash can behind him. Around the corner was a propane cage and a red box against the store's wall. Getting past him would put me in arm's reach. Next, he asked for a ride there, to a homeless shelter. It's very cold outside, and he said he didn't want to freeze during the night. I did empathize with him, but I told him I couldn't at the moment. Instead, I offered to buy him some protective gear, some gloves, and a heavy blanket. Maybe help him ask an employee in the store if they could assist him in finding a ride. Sweet baby Jesus. The guy's face instantly changed to pure rage, then switched back to pleasant, like it never happened. "Well, you know what happens to homeless people when they're stuck outside. You're gonna help me, right? It's just down the street." I was standing there unsure of what to do. My husband was on the phone, asking what was going on. I gently told the man I didn't feel comfortable doing that, and that I had the flu. My husband was on the phone with me as well. "I don't care about your damn flu." Now he was getting more angry and not moving away from blocking my route into the store. I didn't want to turn my back on him to go to my car, which was now several feet away in the dark. While this guy was glaring at me, I decided to rush past him. I had my mask from the clinic in my jacket pocket, so I pulled that out and held it in front of me while I moved toward the trash can. He looked disgusted, but kept telling me I needed to give him a ride. "It's right down the street," he continued to insist. Thing is, I know where that street is, and it was not as close as he said. He was trying to guilt me, and his words felt threatening, but he was very careful to not actually threaten me verbally. Once I was around the corner, I rushed into the store straight to the pharmacy. My husband said he was calling the police. He heard the way the man was talking to me and said to stay in the store. I'm usually not the type to be so afraid when confronted. When I got to the pharmacy, I interrupted the pharmacist and a customer, apologizing and telling them what happened. The pharmacist sent the store manager out, a tall guy with a long beard who didn't take crap from anyone. The police had already arrived. The man was told to leave, which he did momentarily. He came back inside the store though, yelling obscenities and something about me. Now, the store manager told him to get the fuck off. He was trespassing on property. The cops came back to talk to me and told me that they'd arrested him many times. He was loud and liked to yell at people, but he wasn't violent. The pharmacist had me hiding behind the screen where they give vaccines and left the half door to the pharmacy cracked open just in case I needed to get out of there. The cop then also told me the guy's first and last name. I'm not sure if that's normal. The prescriptions were finally filled and I left the store. The police had parked next to my car to make sure I was safe. Oh, and the man refused a ride from the cops to the shelter. Later, I looked him up. His name is unique, so he was easy to find online. Surprise, surprise, he had a very long record spanning 3 states and several counties. Tons of public intoxication charges, DWI, urinating in public, assault and battery. I also looked up the homeless shelter. As I'd thought, there was not one where he wanted me to take him. It was a super sketchy, abandoned area instead. Earlier today, I went to the corner store across from the CVS and told my friend, the overnight shift employee, what happened. She told me she'd had to kick him out of the store a bunch and called the police every time she saw him because he would always yell and threaten customers, but he always took off before the police arrived. I know I could have handled this better. I was blindsided from his instant shift, from perfectly pleasant to filled with rage. A big thank you to the pharmacy team who kept me safe, and the store manager who confronted that creep. They really didn't have to do all of that, but they did anyway. I'm thankful my husband recognized I was in an unsafe situation over the phone and called the police too. The man is still out there, somewhere lurking in my area.